Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Serial Watch.
Today we'll be talking about the atrocities Syrian civilians face on a daily basis by giving a brief history on Syrian struggles, solutions attempted in the past, and a new plan of action to be considered.
Our story began in March of 2011 when protests broke out in the name of democracy, challenging the recent authoritarian actions under President Bashar al-Assad's administration. When Assad was first elected as president, many viewed him as a reformer of sorts, a man to bring success to the failing Syrian economy. Sadly, his methods to achieve his dream were unacceptable to the Syrian people, and his reform attempts failed. Although many opposed a full-scale revolt against the Syrian government, it became apparent that it was necessary as Assad commanded his forces to respond harshly, often resulting in mass arrests and even open fire on protesters. During the summer of that year, protests occurred so often that Assad and his forces felt the need to respond with tanks, artillery, and helicopters. These actions of such violence gained the acknowledgement of the United States, European Union, the Arab League, Iran, and Russia. These states sided differently with Iran and Russia, being the chief supporters of Assad's reign. In October 2011, during a UN meeting discussing Syria's issues, both Russia and China cast vetoes that did not allow for them to crack down on Assad. Late 2011 and early 2012 saw the rise of rebel groups determined to have Assad pay for his actions, as well as many failed peace attempts by organizations such as the Arab League. The summer and fall of 2012 saw success from Syrian rebels, most notably the Aleppo attack in July of that year. However, as more and more revolutionary moments emerged and government defenses continued, the civilian death toll skyrocketed. Hundreds of thousands of Syrian civilians died over the years of continued fighting, with rebels in Assad's reign seeming not to care. The reign would blame and rebels for civilian life and vice versa for the rebels. This improper treatment has gained the attention of various humanitarian groups, such as the UNHCR and Mercy Corps, who have worked daily to try and provide aid for civilians when possible. In 2013, military efforts came to a stalemate when rebels began to take hold in northern areas limited by deficits in equipment while government forces continued to lose support, militarily, politically, and internally. High positions in government began to be deserted as many feared the victory of the rebels, but the fight continued. Civilians continued to be fearful on a daily basis, which at that point in time many had been internally displaced, trying to flee the country or their home cities. Neighboring countries began to provide aid to the rebel forces, while the United States were extremely fearful from the possibility that they would be funding radical jihadist groups. Civilians who tried to flee were always caught in the middle of the battlefield. In August 21, 2013, the neighborhoods of Damascus were victims to chemical attacks where hundreds of civilians died. Syrian rebels denied the attack, and the same was said by the Assad reign. This brought the UN right into the middle of the civilian issue. Investigations began to discover who administered the attack, but no conclusion was reached. All countries denied the use of chemical weaponry, and Assad took this as an opportunity to fight Western aggression. Over the last 4 years, the Syrian civil war had waged on, and the casualties are increasing at an alarming rate. The emergence of the terrorist group ISIS has complicated matters even further. Many countries have cut off their weapons supplies to both the rebel groups and the government forces because of the terrorist group. Most recently, ISIS has conducted an attack on Westminster Bridge and Parliament. This group has prompted fear in many countries such as France, Britain, the United States, and Syria itself. Civilians are constantly at risk, and they have had almost no escape as neighboring countries such as Turkey have stopped accepting Syrian refugees, as well as the United States, banning the entrance of any Muslim citizen once President Trump began his term. In 2016, the UN identified 13.5 million Syrian refugees who struggle to survive without the assistance of humanitarian groups such as the UNHCR, Mercy Corps, and Red Cross. These people have suffered years of torment from Assad and then the beginnings of war. On a daily basis, these people are on the move, running from either Assad's forces or rebel forces, and even ISIS. Neighboring countries have almost all stopped allowing refugees to enter their state, which becomes an even bigger problem in the face of increasing civilian mortality. Our coverage continues right after these messages.
Welcome back to Syria Watch. For the rest of today's program, we will be covering past attempts to resolve Syrian refugee suffering and a new course of action to resolve this crisis. The Syrian war effort has ravaged the country, leaving its people in need of healing. Yet the war drags on and more people die every day. The beginning of peace began almost as fast as the protests started. The Arab League began constituting peace in November of 2011, but failed in January of 2012 because of the sheer amount of violence from Assad's regime and rebel forces. Later on, in June 2012, the Geneva First Conference was initiated by the United Nations Peace Envoy to Syria. This conference was vital in trying to restore peace to the war-torn country, because it was the first time the conflict became of global importance. Famous politicians such as Hillary Clinton and William Hague were in attendance, but despite their best efforts, failed to find a solution that would satisfy both sides. The plan was to institute a transitional governmental body with full executive powers, meaning that a temporary government with the full powers of democracy would take place to resolve the country's issues. This plan failed because of the ignorance of rebellion forces to try and solve problems side by side with members of Assad's regime. Between the Geneva First and Second Conferences, two minor solutions were proposed, being the 16th Summit of the Non-Allied Movement and the Eid al-Adha ceasefire. The 16th Summit Conference was held by Iranian government and invited 120 country leaders and intended to draw up a solution, but no consensus was ever met. The Eid al-Adha ceasefire was created by Lakhdar Brahimi, an Algerian diplomat who became the UN Arab League Special Representative and was meant to stop fighting for the Islamic festival of Eid al-Adha. But the rebels and government were relentless and war dragged on. Even second conferences were held in 2014 and again sought to bring an end to the suffering of Syrian people. Again, the idea of transitional government was brought up and heated arguments ensued, ending yet another attempt at peace. Minor peace talks continued after the disastrous failure of the Geneva Second Conference, all resulting in failure and even more people continued to suffer. However, another major effort, the Vienna process, began in October 2015. October 23, 2015, the Vienna process began with the foreign ministers of the United States, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, who met in Vienna, Austria, to find a solution to the Syrian conflict. Then, on October 30th, the first peace talks began with 20 countries participating, who came up with the need of rebel and regime politicians come together and talk. After that day, these foreign ministers met separately with both the rebel factions such as Ahrar al-Sham and regime members. The rebels came up with a set of principles that both sides must abide during peace meetings, but Assad ruled out these principles, stating that he would not meet with foreign terrorists. The desperation of Assad to cling to his power has kept the Syrian people afraid and damaged. Civilians now live on the outskirts of the country, desperately trying to seek refuge in other countries, afraid of what both sides might do to them. After yet another disastrous failure, the Geneva Third Conferences were held in January 2016. Rebels and regime members finally met, but on the first day of the conference, they could not sit in the same room together. The arguments became violent and a UN envoy staff member ended the peace talks, but rebels now demanded for more destructive weapons. After Geneva Third, peace talks continued and still failed, not allowing for Syrian refugees to be safe and not have to fear dying every second of every day. Attacks on major cities where some people still live have been reduced to rubble because of airstrikes. Even children aren't safe from the horrors of this war. Chemical weapons have been banned, and yet refugee villages are being gassed in the middle of the night, killing entire families, elderly and newborns. These people are in a constant struggle, and peace talks continue to fail. Most recently, the Geneva Fourth Conferences were held between Syrian rebel forces and regime forces. The rebel force in charge this time was the High Negotiations Committee, and the Syrian regime was represented by the Syrian UN ambassador Bashar Jafari. These conferences were all peaceful with both sides, agreeing on focusing more on anti-terrorism and then their own issues against each other.
Breaking news! New information on the possible solution has just been attained.
And we're here to break it down, so let's jump right in.
All peace conferences and ceasefires have ended in utter failure, except the Geneva IB conferences. These meetings focus solely on bringing rebel opposition and regime members together to discuss the fact of terrorism.
Our sources have come up with more conferences and peace talks to focus on these terrorist groups, mainly ISIS, as it has become so large to the point that it's a global threat. ISIS has made the state even more unstable because of many of their attacks are not claimed, and instead blamed on the rebel groups. If this threat were to be eliminated, a main rebel group could represent most rebel ideals, and the regime could meet in peace to come up with a peaceful ending to the people's suffering and torment.
Our organization, the Immigration and Refugee Defense Organization, has advised that various rebel groups, refugee leaders, and regime leaders meet for a peace talk. These meetings will not consist of the attendance of ISIS and instead focus mainly on eliminating them as they pose a major threat to the country's stability. If all goes well at these meetings, the United Nations could create a military force consisting of volunteering soldiers and some enlisted from countries terrorized by them, such as Britain, France, and the United States, to fight off this terrorist threat. Currently, regime soldiers and rebel soldiers fight each other and not ISIS, resulting in fear for refugees who try to escape the country but are stopped by them and killed.
After this threat is eliminated, meetings focusing on establishing a stable democracy could take place. In order for this to occur, multiple parties cannot exist as they could bring further instability. Once a single group who represents the ideals of many rebel forces can be created, then these democratic meetings can be held. This entire process would span over 5 years and cost $500 billion, based on the average counter-terrorist budget for the United States, and finally bring peace to this war-torn country and its suffering people. Refugees would finally be able to return to their homes and would no longer live in fear of death. They would be able to return to their customs and live a long and healthy life.
If this solution, however, fails, ISIS could become a global threat and possibly take control of the state and become more powerful. If it does succeed, then many might consider the United Nations too authoritative and powerful. But this solution could finally bring peace and little complication.
Refugees have suffered far too long for far too many years. Let's bring an end to this atrocity of man. If you would like to help directly, contact www.mercycorps.com. This website contains more information on the Syrian crisis and how donations towards food, water, shelter, and school supplies could help these suppressed people. Thank you.